Okay, you're very welcome back to the final session for this morning before we break for lunch. And our speaker now is Marcin, who's going to talk about the use of cultural heritage towards reconciliation of deeply divided societies. Marcin has a research background in the area. He has a PhD from the University of Łódź for a PhD thesis entitled Crimes Against Cultural Heritage in International Criminal Law, and he's done a series of case studies. So without further ado, we hand the floor to you, Marcin.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, my topic will be a little bit different than those we already had, because I am a lawyer, and as we lawyers, we do like definitions. However, my terminological grid will be rather superficial and brief, because more than definitions, we prefer to analyze mental elements. Like every crime has its mental elements, the intents of the offender. That's why I will put another dimensions of this presentation, because I'm not a political scientist. I am more lawyer and more criminologist. That's why I will discuss some psychological factors, sociological and cognitive factors, which in my mind are of key importance. First of all, I have to tell you that I choose this term deeply divided societies a little provocatively, because this term is very fashionable, very sometimes even overused. But as you will see during my presentation, it has a deeper justification. First of all, what do we understand under this term divided society? In my presentation, I will discuss a strongly polarized society whose parties are in a sharp and intense conflict with each other, trying to delegitimize each other and not even recognize the existence of the other. However, when talking about a deeply divided society, my intention was to pay attention to something more than just a political split. Deeply divided sounds more dynamic, suggesting something more than just a division. So it's like a deep ditch, something even like a gap between two sides of one community. Another element is the widespread hatred of thinking differently, which find its empirical expression in the activities of organized criminal groups, mainly of a terrorist nature, but not always. So, in the deeply divided societies, hate crimes are much more common than elsewhere. So after this briefly introduction, let's go to the causes of conflicts in deeply divided societies. Of course, there are many sources of them, but I would like to pay a special attention to the psychological factors, because in my mind they play a key role. And what is of the crucial meaning are the emotions. And in the case of conflict, there are negative emotions. Because they participating in interactions when we have some type of emotions. So as you see, we have negative and positive emotions. On the left, the negative are responsible for the division of the society. And those who are on the right, positive, those we will use in our reconciliation process. So I will put the cultural heritage to the right side. So in my analysis, I will attempt to demonstrate two different elements of intangible cultural heritage, which in my mind we can use to reunite deeply divided societies. But first of all, it's important to say what the emotion is. So from the psychological point of view, it's something from Latin term emovere, which means to move. The body is moved by something. This movement can come from outside or from inside and is manifested in increased intentions. And our life is continuous balance between the individual and world and emotions. And this is what gives our life color and dynamics. As Zimbardo and Goering put in, without emotion, empathy or cooperation, love, care, as well as fearing on consequences of our action, our life is impossible. A person without emotions becomes a robot, and potentially could be the most dangerous enemy. Those negative emotions are responsible for the divisions in societies. Of course, it's impossible to formulate a comprehensive theory of explaining the transformation process of social structure in divided societies. But in my opinion, a special attention should be given to the three factors: economic, social, and ideological. Because these three emotions constitute the main source of emotional changes, like frustration, anger, contempt, or sadness. And as a starting point, let's take the reflection on the division of societies, taking achievements of Karl Marx. This philosopher is known especially for economic determinism, but I would suggest to consider his works in a broad dimension. Because in contemporary discourse regarding the influence of economic factors on the shape of social structures, one thing is very important. The social existence determines consciousness. So what does it mean? It means that the poverty and indigence lead to exclusion, destructive thinking, pessimism, and vulnerability to radical political solutions. That's why people who are in a poor economic situation used to shake off the responsibility for their material situation to the political establishment. And often poverty combined with unemployment and lack of prospects is the main determinant of entering the path of crime, which is often the case in the countries with low GDP. And what's more, poverty and unemployment are also the reasons why the young people adopt criminal behavior in the societies. Another element, no less influential is the achievement of Max Weber. He points out that the state of ownership is not so important as the position of the individual on the market. And he also thinks that there is no connection between ethnic, racial, or religious differences in such organizations as state institutions or corporations, because divisions are triggered not so much by the goal itself, but by the way it is achieved. Maybe many of you will disagree. However, in some parts of Europe, Max Weber is very popular and his views are really, really current. But my personal opinion would be connected with another gentleman, which I'm going to present you, is this American sociologist Eriksson, and his concept is derived from psychoanalysis, and main focus is on the psychological aspect of human development. Every single period of our life is to shape our personality. The transition from one phase to another is accomplished through an identity crisis. During the crisis, a young man faces the need to define himself as a separate individual unit and define his place in community. That's why Eriksson noticed that belonging to a group can provide security, support, self-esteem, resulting from being part of something bigger than you. That's why this theory is especially important for the explanation why young people decided, why are so open for the new ideologies, and why can be the target of the sects. The drive to belong to the group can involve rejecting people who are different from the group, and hate group represent the most extreme expression of hostility against social minorities. The next step would be to analyze the psychological sources of hatred. To understand why people reject and degrade others, we need to examine the psychological roots of hatred, because it might be very useful to understand what is the first step on the path from lack of knowledge to hatred. And the first is, as I mentioned, lack of knowledge. Because when we don't have any knowledge about something that is different than our group when we used to live, we use the fear of the unknown is appearing. So the next step are the stereotypes. Why do we use them? Mostly to feel secure in our judgment, because it's easy to have some information which is general than to put some effort to gain another type of knowledge. And as the Fisk note, stereotyping means a spontaneous categorization of the world reinforced by negative effect the foreign group. A next step are prejudices, and intolerance. In common usage, those terms mean judging a social group on the basis of pre-existing negative ideas rather than the facts. And those stereotype information about members of a group is preferred. That's why when we learn new things, sometimes we are lazy and we just prefer and to prefer to choose the information which we already know than to discover something that is different than our knowledge and our informations. Next step would, which is when we give emotional load, I mean negative emotional load, and a desire to harm, to prejudice and intolerance, will get a recipe for hatred. And the next step, as you can imagine, are hate crimes. So the crimes which are motivated by the feeling of hate to the others, the hate to people which are different than we are. So, as you see, the path from lack of knowledge to hate crimes, it's not so long. It's very close, and in many divided societies, this is exactly the explanation how lack of knowledge can result in hate crimes. So, my solution, my proposition, how we can solve this problem of prejudices, hate crimes, is by referring to the cultural heritage. And before I will describe what cultural heritage is, we need to answer the question what the memory is and what the purpose of the memory is. Many of you may say that the purpose of the memory is to remember the past. But in my mind, it's not the purpose of the memory because it has a very pragmatic function. The purpose of the memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And the cultural memory is the same thing. Because one of the signs of the great society is the diligence with which it passes culture from one generation to the next. When one generation no longer passes on the things that are dear to it, heroes, stories, religious faith, that passes is null and void, is out of value. And that leaves young people feeling a lack of direction, a lack of purpose in their lives, and they are open to the dictum of Marx that the people derived of their history are easily persuaded. That's why this is when the cultural memory doesn't exist and do not passes on the things which are important, the culture of the society is already dead because they don't have story anymore. And this is something what I would especially like to underline. Because talking about cultural heritage, many of you just can think about material cultural heritage, tangible cultural heritage, but this, what is even more important, is the intangible cultural heritage. And as you see from this diagram, normally when we think about our heritage, we have in our mind everything what belongs to the museums, so paintings, sculptures, buildings and monuments. Of course, they are very important to our heritage, but even more important are these things which are intangible, so oral traditions, expressions, music, dance, games, fashion, or performing arts. Why? The question is why? Because when we do or we observe all of those intangible elements of cultural heritage, we are able to invoke positive emotions. Many of you which are not interested in paintings or sculptures, or any time when you visit museum which doesn't correspond with your interests, you have neutral lot of emotions. However, many of you watching a TV series, watching a football game, dancing, singing a song, using emotions, and mostly positive emotions. And this is the answer why intangible cultural heritage is so important. Moreover, this type of heritage is a source of identity and belonging to a group that provides comfort to the individual. So, in my presentation, I will give an example of two elements of intangible cultural heritage which are of key importance. They are sport and film. And talking about sport, I mean a group physical activity, while by the term film, I understand the whole of audiovisual art. So let's start with sport. I guess many of you don't recognize this gentleman, but the symbol, Olympic symbol, is very, very well known. So this gentleman, Coubertin, is the inviter of the Olympic Games. He was also a very famous activist, and his words, sport is a part of everyone's heritage and nothing can ever replace it, are incredibly current. Because sport has a far greater range of influence than just the activity or form of spending free time. Coubertin mentioned that the participation in physical culture improves man in physical and moral dimension, because it's shaping strong will, pro-social behavior, respect for the opponent, and resignation from dishonest way of winning. That's why sport can be part of intellectual and social education. But also, another important thing is sport as an activity that creates a common ground for cultural exchange, friendship, and peace. That's why when you observe every single time when we have Olympic Games, you can see that the words of Coubertin are also very important. They are principles of every sporting competition. The important thing is not to win, but to take a part. Important thing in life is not triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. To spread those principles is to build up a strong and more scrupulous and more generous humanity. However, the most element of every sport activity is fun, because if you don't have pleasure or fun in your activity, and if you don't treat sport as a value on itself, this kind of activity sooner or later will be discontinued. And for example, I wanted to show you the case study of the Kenyan football tournament, Football for Peace, as an example of using sport for educational role in children's education. Kibera is a slum district of the Kenyan capital. Since 2008, there is a football tournament for the poorest children. And what is important, matches consist of not 2 but 3 parts. First part is a discussion. The second one is a proper game. And the third part is also kind of discussion. What is the most important, while only 3 points can be earned in the match for winning, after the match you can get even 6 points just for sporting behavior. In this way, children learn such qualities which might be useful in adult life, like honesty or respect for the rival. You also may ask if football or sport in general has a meaning also from adults, and the answer is positive. Here you have the very nice picture from 1967 from the which was taken during the blockade of Suez Canal. And you can see the sailors from the opposite countries, from the different political and social backgrounds, who just decided to play a football game together, just as a form of integration between each other. And on the pitch there were Russians, Americans, Arabs, and even Jews, and they were played one game together. And but the key element of success of having this honest rivalry is the leadership. But the leadership will be. I will talk about leadership a little bit later. So the next element, apart from sport, is storytelling as a second component of intangible cultural heritage that can be successfully used to build bridges between divided societies. Storytelling has always been a basic tool in building one's awareness and cultural identity. For centuries, only the forms and ways in which people shared the stories changed. Nowadays, most often stories take the form of TV series, short stories available globally on streaming platforms like Netflix. Those stories, those TV series, have a very important perspective because they can be used to understanding other cultures and other ways of thinking. And in my presentation, I will take 3 case studies. 3 case studies from Turkey, Scotland, and Spain. All of those countries are classified in the literature as a source nations. Source nation because they are source of the of richness of cultural heritage, because of the long history, because of special attitude, how they treat their history and cultural heritage. But also in all of those 3 countries, sectarian movements not only occur, but also repeatedly commit hate crimes against their opponent, and terrorist attacks by separatists took place in those countries. So the first one is the Magnificent Century. It's based on the life of Ottoman Sultan Suleiman, the longest ruling sultan of Ottoman Empire. This super production has been a huge success in almost 40 countries and seen by more than 500 million people worldwide. The phenomenon of Turkish production consists in provoking a lively discussion about the Ottoman heritage, in which many countries are involved. And what is interesting, among Serbian and Macedonian viewers, there are numerous examples of the change in attitude toward Turkey and the stereotypical perception of Turkey in the Balkans. Many of viewers decided to go to Istanbul for the first time just after watching this series. In contrast, for Turkish viewers, can be a lesson from the history, which is showing that their country was most successful when tolerance, diversity, and mutual respect dominated in society. Another case is Scotland. Scotland and the series Outlander. Actually, it's a very interesting case study because what is actually the best way to tell about Scottish language and the history of 18th century as to attract millions of viewers around the world? So the answer is you have to put a story, the love story of English woman Claire Randall and the Scotsman James Fraser. And this plot demonstrates overcoming prejudices related to origin, gender, nationality, and political views. This is not only the analysis of the society of 18th century Scotland, but also it shows the relation to present. Also, this, according to some studies from 2019, this TV show triggered more interest in Scotland than any other cultural artifact in recent years and is boosting a renaissance of Scots language. This year at the University of Edinburgh, there will be an international conference about Scottish cultural heritage just based off this TV series. Of course, the positive effect is a better understanding of Scottish cultural awareness, but the side effect might be the rise of Scottish nationalism against British imperialism. The last case study is the Spanish production La Casa del Papel, what is in English translation is Money Heist. This production of Netflix holds a special place in the fight against prejudices and stereotypes because of the complicated storytelling. It's not usual for a viewer to identify with a criminal who take hostages, but the multi-dimensional characters and the narrative tension made it stand out. The series show people of different origins and characters who unite to achieve a set goal together. Also, the topic of the main antagonized policewoman deserves mentioning because as the story continues, she begins to doubt the legitimacy of her action. Therefore, the biggest advantage of this series is the opportunity to gain a different point of view and question the adopted rules. So those two elements, sport and movies, are, in my opinion, key factors which can be used in shaping strategies for state, local communities, and individuals. However, from the legal point of view, I can tell you that simply only the law is not enough. It's not enough for the lawmakers to make new law or to give local communities money or even some kind of ideas. Because the most important factor is investment in human capital. Because vision, energy, and determination are not enough if you lack human resources. That's why I will show you a very interesting case of the law of the lid. As you see, it's not a cooking class, but you see a pot. Why I'm going to demonstrate you a pot? Because this thing which we cover the pot is the lid. And this is a metaphor to every society. Because no government, no company, no educational system has ever gone higher than the level of the leadership skills. And this lid, which covers the pot, is the level of the effectiveness of the leader. And if the person leadership is strong, the organization's lead is high. But if there is not, then the organization is limited. So it shows you that the key factor is the leadership, because the leadership ability is the lead that determines a person's level of effectiveness. Of course, leadership shouldn't be identified with the management, because management is focused on maintaining system and process. However, leadership is about influencing people. It's the ability of to motivate people. For example, people of Africa have very negative image of leaders because they combine leadership with violence, manipulation, and exploitation. They didn't meet with positive leadership. According to John Maxwell, the author of this law of the lead, the good leader should respect people, think about their needs, add value to them, encourage others to cooperate, and first and foremost, good leaders should be credible. Good leaders should be credible to themselves. Because if a leader is not satisfied with his own behavior, cannot succeed in leading people. That's why the first step is building leadership within you. Constant improvement, learning and development of new skills is a very important element for leaders, because people who are around you will observe leader and will become the same like those leaders. That's why when you are a good role model for your people, for your society, they will observe you and they will imitate you and they will want to be like you. So, as a last conclusion, of course, this presentation don't exhaust the complexity of the topic of applying intangible cultural heritage. Nevertheless, my goal was to highlight the key elements which are necessary to establish some kind of agreement between the parties of the divided society. Both sport and TV series allow creating thought patterns. Sport can be an agent of personal change and development, and film develop imagination and motivate to act. So when any of you will watch any TV series which also has a historical background, you may say that you are studying the intangible heritage of humanity and you are learning how to be a good leader, because with the increase in knowledge, the change to refute stereotypes and prejudices increase as well. So I hope with this presentation, I made a good start for further scientific polemics and searching for new solution, and I'm very grateful for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rao, for a multi-segmented, multi-leveled discourse. I'm going to say a few words by way of reaction, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Noor, who will also speak. This was an expansive paper. It had a wide scope, perhaps at times too wide. But it focused in on a category, a phenomenon which I think is of interest to all of us around the table, that is cultural heritage. And I thought I was impressed by your fluid and I think quite imaginative use of cultural heritage as a basis for reconciliation. Your paper starts with quite ambitious, well, overall your paper is highly ambitious. And whilst ambition is a good thing, sometimes I think ambition needs to be defined within parameters which are appropriate. But you talk about diagnosing psychological and sociological causes of conflicts. You talk about analysing Western strategies which could be applied in the Arab world. I found that slightly problematic because it seemed to assume that superior knowledge could be imported from the West to the Middle East, which I would question personally. Thirdly, you talked about steps for lawmakers, local communities and individuals to build mutually acceptable cultural identity. So to some extent, I felt that you diverged from your own stated objectives, and perhaps that might be worth looking at. Your scope is very wide, and given that necessarily you're restricted in terms of time, it might have been perhaps profitable to take one or two of those elements. You demonstrate a great mastery and a wide level of reading. I was, struck by your capacity to move between disciplines when many of us are certainly less adventurous in that regard. I mean, you looked at the literature on divided societies in terms of legal material, criminology, sociology, political science. So that seemed to me to demonstrate a willingness to occupy the in-between land that is so dangerous for all of us, that requires an assured and adept capacity to move. But it seems to me that you are well located within the literature. You talk about deeply divided societies, and you're attentive to the need to define, which is something that bedevils all our endeavours. How do we define these terms that seem so commonplace? But when you actually come to try and tie them down, it becomes quite problematic. You talked about a deeply divided society as like a hard ditch, a deep ditch, and sometimes even a gap between two sides of a community. You then move on to talk about hate crimes as a manifestation of those deeply divided societies, and you look at psychological factors, you look at economic, social, and ideological, and so on, as one might expect. I was struck by your reference to Marx on the fact that social existence determines consciousness. And you then moved on to Weber. So it seems to me you demonstrate an engaged, a dynamic grasp and a dynamic engagement with thinkers like Marx and Weber. Am I correct in thinking that Erik Eriksson has been perhaps a more powerful influence in terms of how you look at sectarianism? And I suppose at times, having waded through this and having gone into, having immersed myself within your rich texts, and many of your sections are actually self-contained. And as one thing I would say to you, perhaps you might lead the reader more. You know where you're going, but sometimes the reader isn't quite certain where he or she is going, and I would have liked more signposts, because each of your sections they're quite rich and they're quite complex, and I think they might need to be stitched together more fluidly, that we see where we're going. You talked about sectarianism, and you're talking about cultural heritage, but sometimes I feel you need to bring us back to those key concepts. There's no harm at all to situate the reader and to enable the reader to move forward. The reader should have some surprises, it seems to me, but the reader really does need to know where he or she is going. You talked about young people aged 16 to 19 being most susceptible to new ideologies. You didn't provide a source there, so I was intrigued as to, was that a personal opinion, or where did that derive from? Both, okay. You're being a bit hard on young people, I think, but yeah. You have a very nice diagram, fear of the unknown leading to stereotypes, prejudice, intolerance, hatred, hate crimes. This is a difficult paper to comment on because there's a lot happening. As I say, it's multi-textured, it's multi-layered. There's a lot going on. You have a lot of ideas. So I felt you had an image there of a pot. I felt sometimes my intellectual lid was flying off. There was so much happening. I was moving along at such a high rate of pressure. I was boiling over, So again, you should, I think, be explicit as to where you're going, or we risk boiling over intellectually. I wanted you always, though, to come back to cultural heritage, and you disappointed me to some extent, because this is like what was really, I thought, was fascinating about this. How do you use cultural heritage? What is cultural heritage? And how might it practically... And you kind of left us hanging then, or left me hanging on a cliff top, until finally we get to the promised land, right? And you talked about the UNESCO Convention, 2003. I wanted to know more about this. I know a bit about it, but I wanted to know more. I was left feeling hungry to some extent. And you told us customs, knowledge, and skills, and then you move on, appropriately enough, it seems to me, and with skill, to sport and film. But I thought, well, why can't you just use sport as a means of bridging gaps anyway? Why does it need to be an intangible heritage? So there were kind of things like that. Sport is a common ground for cultural exchange, friendship and peace. It's like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, one couldn't, you couldn't really credibly criticize it. But sport could also be, it seems to me, to be a form of communal of division. More often than not, we hear about the racism and the homophobia, which occurs when great soccer teams come together. So there's a dark side to sport as well, which I felt needed to be, we needed to engage with that. You talked about football tournaments for children, football for peace, but that seemed to me to be slightly adjacent to the subject. It was about poor children in Nairobi, and I wasn't quite certain how that was feeding into questions of sectarianism or disadvantage, because you go from one to the other very fluidly. Sometimes you're talking about sectarians, sometimes you're talking about people who are just plain disadvantaged. Movies, yeah, I mean, I loved your emphasis on storytelling. I think that's really important. It's certainly important for us in the humanities and social sciences, where stories count for so much, and it seems to me stories never go out of fashion. They're just told in different ways. You then took three case studies, 3 countries. You looked at Turkey, the Magnificent Century. But again, I'm being slightly contrarian here. I thought the one from Turkey, based on the life of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, could also, on the reverse side, be used as a form of kind of nationalistic, patriotic puffing up. It depended on what mood you were in a given day when you watched this. As to Scotland, you talked about it, I've seen, it was a peculiar series, I saw some of them. They're not speaking Scots, by the way, they're speaking Gaelic. It's a different language. Sorry to be pedantic, but...
Some of the words were Scottish, and
yeah.
I learned some Scottish words from this.
But what do you mean by Scottish?
Like...
What language are you talking about?
It's Gaelic.
Gaelic, okay, you call it Scots. That's a different language, okay? So just to be careful there. I thought, well, if I looked at this, 1745 Jacobite uprising, I'd be madly anti-English. I didn't see how I would, in any way, use this as a form of reconciliation, but perhaps that's my own particular bias. I thought it stroked Scottish nationalism as opposed to acting as a bridge. But again, I think this is where, this is such a controversial area. I mean, you know, it's two sides of a coin. It could be negative, it could be positive. And I thought maybe you needed to be more attentive to that. You looked at Spain, and that certainly seemed an appropriate movie. Then you talked about leadership, and this is where I became a little bit lost, I must admit. And you talked about Maxwell's law of the lid. And I felt that you needed to tell us much more clearly why you thought this was relevant and how that related to the previous sections. So, you know, your sections are well informed, they're well crafted, they're well drafted. You know the literature across an amazing range. I mean, I was quite impressed. But I felt at times that we were going from one thing to another, and it wasn't being made clear to the reader. And I think this is often, when somebody becomes so expert and so knowledgeable, they write in a way which is actually reflective of their deep, deep knowledge, but they don't make allowances for those of us who are not as well informed, and that's a useful thing to do. I was slightly baffled at the end how you then segued into leadership, and that was fine. You told us a lot about leadership, but I wasn't quite certain how that related back to the question at hand. So to sum up, I thought it was a very rich, very stimulating, well-researched, thoughtful, reflective paper, and I thought it was reflective of deep, deep reading across a variety of disciplines. Always a difficult thing to do, but I would like to have had a more concise focus on cultural heritage, and I would like to have seen the sections link. The sections are well designed and very well written, but how they actually inform each other and where the reader is going. I think I'll hand over to my colleague, Noor.
So, first of all, I really enjoyed reading the paper, and it's really well written and well contextualized in terms of analyzing the psychological and social aspects of hatred. I'm not going to repeat what Marx has said about the paper. I'm just going to give you like small advices about, for instance, like you might need to identify what you mean about cultural heritage from the prospects of UNESCO, or either from critical heritage analysis, critical heritage studies. These are like, there's vast literature about that. I could like provide you with some literature about it, because actually it's my PhD project is completely about how we use heritage as a therapy for post-conflict societies. There is a nice literature also for Len Meskel. She has written about how can we use heritage in South Africa in post-conflict context. How can we use it to heal the fragmented society in South Africa? You've spoken about heritage transformation. Also, there is also vast literature about that, and I guess Alison can help me with that. Cornelius Holtroff in Sweden, he has written a lot about how heritage can be transformed in terms of conflict and post-conflict terms. And if you want to use it as a tool for healing the divided society, it would be beneficial for the paper, I guess, to use such references or such literature. I really like the distinction at the beginning between tangible and intangible heritage, but let me be frank with you. After like a while of being in the heritage field, like heritage can be like a double-edged sword, or like as we say in Arabic, sayf du haddin. It can be used, to be honest, to heal the division, and in many cases it's being used as a tool for dividing the society. And through sports or films, there are many examples about that, like the case of sport, for instance, in the football. We heard about the Clásico between Real Madrid and Barcelona. It's like created to divide. It has been used by the fascist regime in Spain to divide the society by supporting one team over the other, because the other has been separatist. Also, at the same time, recently, it has been used as a sort of to show how people can overcome the conflict. For instance, the last Gulf Cup that happened here in Qatar, many, like Twitter and social media, were flooded with pictures of Saudi and Bahraini players going out with Qatari players, showing like politics can divide us, but sports can unite us at the same point. Perhaps some examples about that would show like a different aspect of your paper. The part about the films. Yesterday I was in discussion with Ihab about Netflix. Actually, I'm not very sure about how Netflix is objective nowadays, especially after they launched the TV series The Spy, that explains about the life of Eli Cohen, the spy that was captured in Syria. They are providing actually the Israeli narrative from that, and there are huge parts, I've been discussing them with Ihab yesterday, that they are actually far away from being true. And I'm not sure how can we rely on Netflix in commemorating or making the memory of our lifetime. To be honest now, audiovisual effects, films, movies, TV series are actually the living memory of our century or of our time. So if we are going to include some stories that are not related to the facts, we might actually manipulate our history. So I need, perhaps like there is a new term now is going on in the heritage studies. It's about like shared heritage. The shared heritage that can be used between actually colonizers and the colonized states, or between two conflicting nations. So they agree both on a shared history, shared heritage, and a shared memory that can be spread all over the nations. There was another example actually about the films, but I will just skip it and leave the floor to Mark, maybe to open the floor for questions, maybe. Okay. Thank you.